Hi everyone. So my name's Zayne, and I'm fascinated about the brain. I'm fascinated about the way the mind works, or doesn't work, because a lot of times it doesn't work. And that was false, because I haven't learned how to stop reacting. I think that's going to be a continuous thing. I think that's, unfortunately, if you want to get one thing out of this, is that there's no solution. There's just ways to help try and solve this problem. Anyway, let's move into this test. Anyone seen this before? Okay, I've got a question for you. You can't see it that clearly. Which of those two tabletops, is longer than the other? Is it the one on the left or the one on the right? Can you see it? It's a bit vague, but if you look really closely. There's always some smart people in the audience that know the answer to this, but that's not the point. It's not the point. Okay. Who says it's the one on the left? Who says it's the one on the right? Okay. Have a look. Okay, there's the tabletop. Okay. This shows you how messed up your brain is. It's something to do with how our eyes are made to observe things in three-dimensional space. And the drawing on the screen is two-dimensional, and our eyes automatically try and adapt it to be a three-dimensional image. So what we do is we make the one table look like it's longer. And that's why this one on the left looks longer than on the right. But now that's just a biological quirk of humanity. What really gets interesting is how the brain does the same sort of things. Anyone here know of Daniel Kahneman? Kahneman, sorry. If that's correct, then I'll change. So Daniel Kahneman wrote a very good book called Thinking, Fast and Slow. And in this book, there's two systems of thinking. The one is the fast, unconscious, automatic, everyday decisions and error-prone kind of thinking. So that is the kind of thinking that you do without thinking. But actually, you do think, you just think very quickly. So those are all the patterns that you use when you have to respond quickly, for instance, or when your let's not say the rational brain, but when your thoughtful brain doesn't kick in. And then there's a second system of thinking, which is what he's called a very bland word, system 2. And that's when you actually slow your thinking down. Your conscious mind starts coming into play there. It's a lot more effortful to be in that particular state of thinking. Also, it's where you can do complex decision making as opposed to in system 1, where you can make everyday decisions. So what would be an example of a system 1 way of thinking? Can anyone give me something? Driving. Perfect. What's amazing, though, about driving is that there's so many things that go into it, but we've learned how to do it without even thinking about it. Granted, some people should probably think more about it than others, but that's not the point. What would be the opposite side? Complex decisions. Planning, strategy, figuring out if you've got to do your tax forms, writing a presentation for Agile Africa, that sort of stuff. Okay. There's that kind of thing. So if we look at the system 1, under system 1 is where all our cognitive biases come in. So those are all the things that all the shortcuts, all the things, what they call heuristics, that come into play when we need to make decisions really quickly. And they evolved that way to solve certain problems. And these were the 4 problems that someone decided to categorize them in. And I think it makes a lot of sense. His name's Buster. It's really cool. He wrote the Cognitive Bias Codex. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but he categorized it like this. So the first one is too much information. Our cognitive biases try to deal with us not being able to process all this information at the same time. The second one is, well, let's just go through them one by one. It's not that kind of too much information. So the first point is we notice things that are already in our memory. We notice things that have already been primed or been repeated often. Let me say that again. We notice things that are already primed in our memory. Some of you are slow. Okay. Then, the second thing that we do is often we figure out that, wait, this is completely different to what I've experienced before. So if you're sitting in the McDonald's and Barney walks in, you're probably going to remember it. So things that are out of the ordinary are things that generally stick in our brains. And often we notice when something has changed. So if there's specifics, if this pattern had been going on for a while and something changes, then that's something that you will notice, but you'll also put a value to it. Your mind will automatically do that. And we're also drawn to details that confirm our existing beliefs. Does anyone know what the bias is for that one? Confirmation bias. Yes. We love confirming what we already know. Okay, and then this one is pretty much what I'm talking about today, is we notice flaws in others more easily than flaws in ourselves. So I notice flaws in you guys lots more than I notice in myself. I'm sure you do the same thing. Okay, then the next, not enough meaning. So this not enough meaning is, for instance, we get a lot of information, but it's not always consistent information. It's not always about the same thing. So we don't always know how to relate things to each other. So we piece things together. And humans are remarkably good at pattern recognition. So we find stories and we find patterns, even in the sparse data that we get. We also love stereotypes, putting people in lovely little boxes and categorizing them. So these are developers, these are analysts, these are POs, these are project managers. They're not Scrum Masters. That was a big thing last year. Then we imagine things and people we're familiar with as being, well, let's try that again. We think of the people that we're fond of or that we know well more fondly than those that we don't. It's a way of saying, well, one of the anecdotes about this is that babies very quickly learn to, there's two things that they learn very quickly, and the one is to figure out if there's a person that speaks their own language and a person that speaks a different language, they'll be more drawn to the person that speaks their own language, as in their parents' language. Also, in terms of race, they will tend to go towards people of the same race before when they're quite young. These are fascinating studies that have been done. Then another one is we simplify probabilities and numbers to make it easier to think about. We always round up, we round down. It's a lot easier to work through. And we think we know what others are thinking. I know what you're all thinking. We project our current mindset and assumptions onto the past and future. Now, this is a great one because we think we know some things based on what happened in the past, so we project it into the future, but then things don't quite happen like they should have. Project plans come to mind when I think about that. Okay, and then the other one is need to act fast. One of our basic primal needs was to be able to run away from things when we were chased, or run towards things, or just being able to do things quickly to get out of danger. So we developed a whole lot of ways in which we can get around that. And one of this is, in order to act, we need to be confident. And we want to make sure that what we do is important. This is a nice one as well. We like to have things that are close to us and that we can relate to, because we can focus on those things. So if we, for instance, if we're doing a task, it's much easier to stay focused on that task because it's what's immediate, even though we know that we've actually got hundreds of other things that we should have been doing instead. But we'd rather be cleaning out the cupboard in the kitchen than doing the work that we needed to do. And to get anything done, we're motivated to complete things that we've already vested time and energy into. The sunk cost fallacy, know about that one? Yeah. So when we want to act fast, that's what we like to do. To avoid mistakes, we're motivated to preserve our autonomy and status in a group and to avoid irreversible decisions. Okay. We favor options that appear simple or that have more complete information over more complex, ambiguous options. Yeah, simplicity. So we prefer to dumb things down rather than to deal with stuff which is a lot more complex. But I think that's a little bit of or a little bit strange in the Agile world, because in Agile we talk about wanting to make things simple. So it's a little bit against what our nature is. And then the last thing is about what should we remember? So when we've got all this stuff coming into us, we've got all this disparate information, we can't make a lot of meaning out of stuff. We need to act really fast. When we now need to take stuff in and memorize it for later, what is the stuff that we're going to be taking in? And how do we go about doing that? Well, firstly, we're not as bad as Dory, but we sometimes I feel often I am pretty much like Dory. So we edit and reinforce some memories after the fact. Now this is a well-known documented issue. If you've ever read anything about the now I'm forgetting the words. You see, this is the memory slide, and I forget my words right when the memory slide comes on. In a court case, the people that, the witnesses, there we go. Ah, jeez. Okay. So, witnesses. Witnesses don't generally remember things as objectively as everyone says. So a lot of the research is going into this now to try and figure out how we can avoid false testimony or false witnessing based on certain characteristics that happened during the witnessing of the crime or the event. So we tend to add stuff in. We edit things out. We add a gun in, or we add a surly-looking character in when it wasn't actually that. Our memory is fascinating. And we discard specific to form generalities. It goes back to the stereotyping. We like to put things in boxes to make categorization easier. So when we categorize, we don't have to worry about all the details about that individual person. So yes, you might be a woman, but that's easy enough for me to deal with. But if you're a woman with blonde hair and green eyes, then it just gets complicated. Okay, so generalizing is what we do. We reduce events and lists to their key elements. Often, you can't remember past number 3. In fact, even getting to number 3 on a list is really difficult. So we tend to generalize on that as well, to make memory easier. And we also store memories differently to how they were experienced. So if you were in a car crash, that event will be stored very differently to when you were walking with your partner through the fields and having a great experience. The reality is that they get stored differently in your brain. So, you all suffer from bias blind spot. Yes, you. Don't say you don't, because you do. I don't, but you do. Okay. Is there anyone here who thinks they don't suffer from blind spot bias? Good. But you're all advanced, agile coaches, all into this stuff, all into the mindfulness and improving. So you all know this stuff anyway. Actually, I don't know why I'm doing this talk. So there was a great study done on this, and I think this is a really great quote because it proves that blind spot or bias, blind spot, has very detrimental effects if you aren't aware that you have a blind spot. For instance, you'll be less accurate at evaluating your own abilities. We listen less, and we know how important listening is for being an agile coach. We're also less likely to learn. And agile being what it is, this world that we live in, we all want to learn. We all want to continuously grow. We can't grow if we don't know that we've got problems, if we can't see those blind spots. So the first one I'm going to talk about, one of the first cognitive biases, is this thing called the curse of knowledge. Okay. So we were talking earlier about drawing, and I tried to do some rough drawings, but I know that there's great sketch notice here, so please excuse the quality of my drawing. But if we take a look at our own journey, so we started long ago, way far back, in the waterfall days, where we pushed up against the waterfall, the evil waterfall. But then we progressed, and we dealt with siloism, and we figured out how to deal with silos. We eventually got our little red scarf of greatness, and we managed to get a team to work together well. And I mean, this takes a bit of time. Then we've got a full cape because we managed to get a whole lot of teams together, and eventually we got the sword of wisdom. And this journey may have taken some of us 15 years, 5 years, whatever it is. But the point is, you've got a whole bunch of knowledge, and it's really difficult for us to put ourselves in the mind of the people that aren't there. Those people, does this thing have a... Yeah, it does. Those people that are still there pushing against the waterfall. When we talk about stuff, we often lose people. We do these fantastic diagrams and we talk about servant leadership and mutual learning and the 8 rules and the VUCA model and the this and the that. These people have just heard of the Agile, have just discovered this thing called the Agile, and often we just lose them. So the curse of knowledge, we don't often understand how to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we're trying to help. I think we all know this one. Who doesn't know Dunning-Kruger effect? No one's going to put up their hand, of course. Hey, yes. Someone put up their hand. Okay. This is the effect that unskilled people generally have a higher reasoning of their abilities, whereas highly skilled people often consider their abilities to be a lot worse than they are. So if you've heard of Impostor Syndrome, so this is where Impostor Syndrome comes from. And look, an example of this, I mean, I shouldn't say we all, I'm sure some people have experienced going into a team and you've got a new Scrum Master, and after one sprint, the Scrum Master says to you, thanks, you can go and coach another team now, I know everything. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. They don't yet know that they don't know what they don't know. But then you get the other side, and this is what applies to a lot of coaches. And I know a lot of us suffer from this, is the imposter syndrome. We've learned so much information, gone through that lovely path that we've taken. We've learned all this wonderful information, but yet we still judge ourselves as not knowing enough. So the more we know, we think we know even less, or there's this world that opens to us the more we learn, so that we think, well, we don't know enough. I don't think that one goes away either. This availability heuristic is also a fascinating one. So this often happens. I mean, if you look at the news, it always talks about bad news. I mean, all the news broadcasts are generally bad news. But the reality is that that's not what happens. There's a lot of other stuff that happens in the world as well. But we only hear what's covered. So we only take in and act on or make decisions on the information that is filtered to us. So that's called the availability heuristic. And leading into this is the hostile attribution bias. So this guy, I'm sure, isn't making fun of him, but yeah, that's pretty much what it means. The idea is we think someone has done us wrong, or we take the wrong meaning from someone instead of just taking it for face value. So there was an example of this that I was thinking of. This often happens in corporates. Let's say, for instance, you're in a stand-up, and a person from another team in another business unit comes to join the stand-up. And it's not normal. This is the first time that they come to join the stand-up. So what happens is you observe and you think, well, why is this person doing it? Well, you know that they're doing a similar, they're waiting for you for software, and you're a little bit late in delivering that software, but they're waiting for you, and so they've sent this person. So your immediate thought is, are they trying to spy on us, or what are they doing? This person starts asking questions. So when do you think we'll be able to deliver this piece of software? And the team doesn't really know how to answer this. And, so you take them on, you say, look, we'll get to it when we get to it. And you find out that this person actually was trying to find out from you if you needed someone else from their team to come and join you, so that they could come and help your team. But no, you went and jumped to conclusions, because in your mind all these things are playing out. So that's an example of the hostile attribution bias. And this can be very prevalent in a corporate environment. I don't know how many of you work in a corporate environment, but the reality is there's always lots of politics, there's lots of all sorts of wonderful stuff for us to deal with. And so you often get sucked into that system. And I think what's nice about us as Agile coaches is we have to step back a bit. So if there's any questions about these, you can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask. This is a lovely one. Anyone heard of the not invented here bias? We're so good at this. There's so many good things out there, but no, it wasn't invented in my team, or we didn't come up with this, so we won't take it on it. That's yours. So I've got an example of this. I've been in a team where another business unit has come up with a new guidebook for how they're going to do Agile. And it's taken a lot of effort and time to do this. So they've basically come up with it's really decent, it's well documented, and it's marketed very well, and all the nice graphics and logos are, and it makes a lot of sense. But this other business unit won't adopt it because it didn't come up from them. So you think to yourself, well, you could go through the hassle of building this whole thing again yourself, or you could just use some of this, or all of it. So that's another example of a cognitive bias. Who's heard of the confirmation bias? Yeah. Cool. She's a witch. Even at a false nose. So I think I was trying to figure out an example of what confirmation bias is for a coach, how this would apply to us. And then I realized while I was busy doing this presentation that I was doing exactly this in my presentation. So you go down these rabbit holes, you read up about this thing, and then you think, oh, that's cool, and you read up about this thing, and the next minute you've spent 5 hours and you've only learned about this thing and how fantastic it is, and you don't realize that actually there's an alternative point of view which says, that thing's great, but there's also this particular way of looking at things. So the confirmation bias is about we take stuff that we already know and we reinforce it with new stuff. Or we only see stuff that reinforces what we already know. There was it flows nicely into this one, this Semmelweis reflex, which is a way of saying we're pushing against anything that's new, that disturbs my existing paradigm. So I was at a conference last year, around this time actually, and about this area. And I was fascinated because there were a lot of talks. Well, no, it wasn't. There was one long session where people came in and out talking about safe versus not safe, safe versus not safe. And I thought it was quite funny because people were very stuck in their particular confirmation bias, and they were not willing to listen to how the other side was positioning their argument, not willing to take it on. So that made me think of this one. Neither side was willing to look at the pros and cons of the other one's argument. So it's something we should watch out for. I'm not saying one is right or wrong. I'm not going to get into that argument now. And then the survivorship bias. So, for instance, in fact, this one won't go down so well now, but I was thinking about using Elon Musk as the example of this guy who plowed through and survived and blah, 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 but now he's might be moving on to the other side. But the underlying thought around this survivorship bias is we tend to only remember the people that really shot the lights out, and we tend to forget the 500 others that did exactly the same thing but didn't get to those results. So there's there are loads of people scattered around Silicon Valley that didn't quite make it. They did the same thing, they got the same funding, they had the same business plans, everything. So the fact is the news only shows us the survivors, the big ones. So that's the only thing that we think about. And we tend to model ourselves on those as well. Whereas we should really take into account that there's other people that didn't do those things, so maybe those things aren't necessarily the things that made them successful. This is a nice one. I know someone personally who loves doing this. Reactance. This is if someone tells you that you should be doing something in a specific way, or that you should be doing something. Reactance is when we have an aversion to that. So we push back and we say, no, we're going to do it our way. It's a great one as coaches, I think, because we tend to fight against things anyway, because we see that generally trying to coach people to be agile is about getting them to think differently. So I assume that most agile coaches like to think differently anyway. So when someone pushes down something on you, for instance, if your product owner tells you that you need to do something, then sometimes we push back and we just say no, just for the sake of it, without actually thinking about what that person was actually telling us, and maybe taking the merit for what the messages behind how they were saying it. So reactance, fun one. Okay, before I get to the next one, I've got a little quiz for you. A man and his son are in a terrible accident and are rushed to the hospital in critical care. The doctor looks at the boy and exclaims, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." Does anyone know the answer to this? A couple of you should know this. Who wants to say? Yes. How many of you struggled to think about that, or struggled to come to that answer, or immediately considered that the surgeon or the doctor was a man? Very common. Also because it was reinforced by the many gender-specific words that were mentioned there. Man, his, son, doctor looks at the boy, can't operate on this boy, he's my son. So we're hearing a lot of male words, which makes us think, naturally, the doctor is male. That's not the case. So stereotyping. Fascinating thing, stereotypes. I can't get enough of them. But we shouldn't have them. We shouldn't have them, but we can't get enough of them. This one as well. This one always gets to me. I was in a session the other day and I was told I wasn't allowed to wear a pink scarf, a shawl. So I thought, okay, well that's a bit weird. Why can't I wear pink? Pink was actually a boy's color up until about the 1940s, I think it was. So it's only recently, and it was actually one of the president's wives who started wearing a lot of pink. And then pink started becoming, used to get worn in the fashion circles because the president's wife wore it, and that became the default color. But now, pink is gold. I personally think it goes wonderful with my skin. And here's another one. So we stereotype our business like this all the time. We think business is business, because we generally work with IT, so business are the people that just give us deadlines and they don't care about the estimates. But we're stereotyping them as well when we do that. So perhaps we should reconsider, maybe we talk about bringing IT and business closer together. So maybe we should try and understand business a bit better. Then we might understand why they are so concerned about deadlines. And this one's also a great one. It's called the law of the instrument, or Maslow's hammer. If the only tool you've got is a hammer, how does this finish? Everything looks like a nail. Okay. Yeah. We love this one too as coaches. So for instance, if you're doing a transformation across a business, not every team is going to be a software development team that you're working with. But no, we must do Scrum. Let's put in Scrum. It's the legal team. Let's put in Scrum. It's the auditing team. Let's do Scrum. People, there's a bigger world out there. Can we move past this? Scrum is great. There are other options. Like safe. I wasn't going to go there. Okay. Actor-observer bias. I like this one because it shows up something that I've often experienced. When you are in a discussion with someone and they have an argument which you don't necessarily appreciate, you attribute that to their personality or their behavior or something like that, but you attribute it to them as a person. If the same thing happens to you, let's say, okay, let's give an example. You are driving down the road and there's a car that throws its rubbish out of the bin, out of the window, no bin. You attribute that behavior to the person. You don't necessarily think about, you blame that person. That's a terrible person, whatever. If you had to do the same thing, your argument in your head might be, there was no dustbin anywhere, and I had to get out of the car because it was a smelly piece of food that had been rotting, so I'm just going to throw it out the window. You're attributing it to something outside of yourself. We love doing that as people. So I can see the bias in you, I can't see it in me. I can see your behavior being bad, but mine is because of these other external circumstances. This is another funny one. Does anyone know of Hans the horse? Clever Hans. A fascinating story. I think it was around the early 1900s. Well, there was photography, so it must have been around somewhere there. And there was this guy who owned this horse that could do math. And the horse would tap its hoof the number of times it needed to answer the equation. But then this guy thought, wait, hang on, there's something fishy around here, or something horsey about this. And did a study on it and realized that what was happening was that Hans's owner was giving subtle clues to the horse without even knowing it. So when let's say it was 4 + 4, and the horse would tap its hoof, and when it got closer and closer to 8, the owner would start giving visual signals of excitement, of tension, like, you're getting there, you're getting there. And when he got to 8, he would change his behavior, and then the horse would stop. So the horse could count, but only by watching the owner. So the moral of this is often we can influence the people that we're working with by giving them subtle hints. Like the phrasings, for instance, of how we tell people things can often influence them to go in a certain path. So for instance, you can say to a Scrum Master, if you're coaching a Scrum Master, I'm sure you've read the Scrum Guide. And by saying it in that way, that person is less likely to say, oh no, I haven't read it, because they assume now, oh shit, what if I haven't read it? What's this person going to think of me? So phrasing can be very important in our jobs. So to try and wrap this all up, I think the important thing is that we need to try and move from a system 1 way of thinking to a system 2 way of thinking. It's not easy though, because system 1 is automatic and it'll still be there. But what we can do is try and do there's a few little tips and tricks that we can use to try and figure out when we're in the system 1 mode. And the first one is for us to acknowledge your bias. So the one thing that the AA really gets marks for is you have to acknowledge that you have a problem. And I think we have to acknowledge that we have a problem, all of us. Tripwires is something that you can use to get around this. So a tripwire, for instance, is something that will trip you up when you get to a certain point to make you realize that you're following a certain path. So for instance, if you know that there's a deadline, that if we are working towards a certain date, and by 80%, or let's say by 30% of that timeline, we realize that we're nowhere near close, we put a tripwire that says we will stop, and we will have to reassess, and we will have to then do X, Y, and Z. So tripwires can really help you to stop things like the sunken cost fallacy. So put deliberate measures in place at certain times or at certain things in your path to make sure that you account for this. Keeping diaries. It sounds innocuous, but what a diary can really help with is hindsight bias. I didn't talk about hindsight bias, but it's the ability to, well, it's the thought process of seeing things as, oh, it was obvious in hindsight. But a diary, for instance, is a way of saying, actually, it wasn't that obvious. These were the things we did. These are the things that we thought about, and we learned from it this way. So it's a much easier way of going back factually and seeing what your thought process was during the time, and then making a rational change or a conscious change afterwards. This is important. We often get people into our groups that are the same as us. So we get more coaches that think the same way, more people that are as mindful as me, more people that are as little biased as I am. But the reality is we should be surrounding ourselves with people that think differently to us, because that'll challenge us. That'll challenge our default way of working. So if we find someone that thinks completely differently to us, and we allow them to have their thoughts and bring it out within our group, it's going to help us to understand where we may have biases. Multiple perspectives is another furthering of that. So not only find a devil's advocate, but also surround yourself with a whole lot of different people with different attitudes, different thinking processes, different backgrounds, different cultures, so that you can see a situation from multiple perspectives. Create a backlog. This you should be able to do relatively easy. I can't. I'm going to put up my hand and say I'm useless at backlogs. That's why I have a great team around me that helps me with this. But the reality is that a backlog can help you from changing your scope. As we teach our teams, a backlog can also help you to keep focused on the right priority. And it's a way of consciously going back to a list and saying, these are the things that I need to do in this order, rather than just this next thing's got to happen, this next thing's got to happen. I think that's the reason why backlogs were created in the first place, is that very conscious thought process of what we need to do next, decision making. And then consciously breaking down stereotypes. There's a book called Blind Spot, which talks about methods that you can use to get rid of blind spots, to get rid of stereotypes. And it's things like putting up pictures on your screensaver of your computer of things that break the stereotypes. So pictures of female surgeons, we had that example, or anything else that breaks a specific stereotype. People wearing different clothes. I don't know, anything that you can think would break a stereotype. And constantly reinforce that so that you are getting more used to seeing things that aren't fitting into a stereotype. That'll help you break that down. Asking questions always helps. So when you find that you want to act fast, when you want to, there's too much information coming in, when you find that you have to try and solve something, try and catch yourself and ask yourself a question, for instance, how else could I interpret this situation? If there was a devil's advocate in the room, how would they see this particular situation? Things like that to just step back from the situation and frame it from a different perspective. Feedback is a great mechanism for this as well. Hopefully, we can get feedback on a regular basis. And how many of you work in a coaching team? Okay, there's a few here. Okay, if you do, you're quite lucky, but you're also challenged because coaches don't often, I've struggled, let me not say generally, I've struggled in coaching teams to get us to give each other feedback. We tell our teams that they must do it, but we don't actually do it very well. But if you have got people around you, then you can be in a group where you can give each other feedback regularly and start pointing out some of these biases to each other, and obviously feel open enough and in a safe space to do that. It's a fantastic mechanism to do so. Then you can use computers, algorithms, AI, to try and get around some of these biases. This is the digital way of doing things. But if you think about, so I have an argument with my partner regularly about the Google Maps versus good old school, just following your path. Because I believe that Google's got all this data and it knows exactly which road is congested and which isn't. And I'm sure a lot of people think that way. But then there's the other argument that, no, but this thing can't know everything. It's just a computer. What if it breaks down? But the reality is that we have technology now that can help with this stuff. We have technology that can help us make better decisions because there's access to better data. So it is something that we should consider. And it should be considered within our own coaching practice as well as the businesses that we work in. So for instance, tracking the progress of your teams, making sure that we put those measurements in, that can help some of your biases. And then groupthink. Try not to surround yourself with too many people that think exactly the same as you. It's going to cause problems. And that's it. So I want to leave you with Blind Spot and say that if you want to know anything more or follow me on my blog, there's my details. If there's any questions, any thoughts? Yep.
Thank you, Zayne. You confirmed a few biases for me. Any questions for Zayne? We have 2 minutes. So if we have comments or questions. Yeah?
So it's just, it's a good thing to think about. How do you practically go and create that culture where you actually invite feedback often, so that you don't go down that path of actually just, we're going Agile now, so this is the way we're going to do things, and all the literature says that, but actually really invite that questioning, learning aspect, so that you can actually hear the different voices.
I've seen that work in some places not, but I found that the only way to do it is you have to personally invite that feedback in. So you make that effort to go to as many people as you can to get feedback on certain things. It's not easy, and people sometimes look at you funny, but if you show people that you want to improve, it can sometimes be infectious. It also sometimes doesn't work, and I've seen places where people just don't take it on. But yeah, you have to start that practice yourself.